So your sales team says they just want more leads, but your CFO wants you to only spend money on things that you can measure. But in today's episode of Closing Time, we're going to talk all about spending your precious marketing funds on branding and why that might be a good idea. Thanks for tuning into Closing Time, the show for go-to-market leaders. My name is Chip House. I'm the CMO at Insightly CRM, and today I'm joined by Dale Harrison, who is a consultant and strategist in B2B marketing. Welcome to the show, Dale.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So I'm super excited to have this conversation because I saw a post that you'd done on LinkedIn, which combined some data from different research that's been done on the value of spending on demand creation or branding on your brand. And I think a lot of marketers really stress out about this. And especially as we're going into planning season for budgets next year, how much spend should go towards content, towards branding, and how do you justify that to your CFO and to your head of sales, frankly, that is still going to generate business for you over time. And so let's start there, Dale.
Okay. I think that the key point is if you look at the data, there's been a number of research projects in the last couple of years looking at B2B enterprise sales. A very good one from Bain & Company. There's another one from Gartner. And if you combine these research studies to give kind of a global look at how how a particular sale will move through the process with a large B2B company. One of the things that comes out of this is the fact that about 80% of buying groups will already have a day one consideration set before they begin any purchase research, which means all of those intent signals that you're picking up out in the market are really only occurring after about 80% of your potential customers have already come up with a consideration set. So they're starting with a group of vendors. Typically it's going to be around 3, maybe 4 vendors that they'll select. It'll typically be the market share leader plus maybe 1 or 2 additional companies that are in the top 5 or top 10 market share leader positions, and then maybe a challenger brand. This is in place before they begin to do any research, before they're going to show up on a Google search, before they're going to come to your website or anything else. But the critical thing here is that the final buying decision, 90% of the purchase decisions come out of that initial day one consideration set. And what that means is that if you're not already known to them before they begin to research the category, then you've got a very, very thin chance of becoming, of actually getting selected. And then the other thing, there's a separate piece of research that comes out of Gartner looking at the rate at which these buying decisions end in a no decision. And that number is between 40 and 60%. So, a rough rule of thumb is about half of B2B purchases end in basically a decision to stay with the status quo. And so you combine these together, and what you see is that if your prospect is not already aware of you before they begin the purchase process, you really have about a 5% chance of being selected during the research process and then actually winning the deal for those deals that actually close. So the challenge there is how do you get into that day one consideration set? And the answer is by doing the work ahead of time where you're communicating to future buyers and you're giving them information about the existence of the brand, what your key point of differentiation is, enough information that they'll be able to remember you when a need emerges.
I love that. We've actually had a lot of guests on talking about the evolution of digital marketing. And for example, Chris Walker was on, and he's talked a lot about the concept of demand creation, which is much more like branding spend, where you're really focusing on delivering valuable content to your audience, versus demand capture, where you're just capturing the demand that already exists. And a lot of his argument has been, if you only focus on capturing the existing demand, you're not impacting the other 90% that's not in the market for your solution. And I love your scientific approach to this, Dale. That's part of what really I was excited about. And because I know you've been a physicist, you've been in the biotech space, you've led sales teams, you led finance teams. So your perspective on this, I think, is really, really unique. And so is that how you see it? Does that emerge from the numbers as well? It's just super important to get into that buying set and make yourself aware, make your brand part of the awareness set for the 90% before they even get into market. Is that right?
Right. And part of what this is also predicated on is this idea of the 95-5 rule. This comes out of research from a professor named John Dawes out of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. And what he looked at was within a given category, what percentage of buyers are in market at any given time. And the outcome of his research across multiple geographies, multiple categories, was that about 5% of your market is in market at any given time. About 95%, lack an active current need. And so, they represent your future buyers, but they don't represent people that you're going to be able to capture demand currently. If your entire marketing effort is around performance marketing, then you're really narrowly focused on that 5%. And you're focused on that 5%, basically trying to capture them once they come in market, which means that you are very much behind the eight ball, as opposed to having some portion of your marketing being spent toward brand. It's not just brand awareness. There's a more technical term called mental availability, which is they need to be aware of you, but then they also need to understand, they need to have recall triggers that are associated with buying situations. And, so this goes beyond just simple awareness into something a bit more nuanced and a bit more complex. And these are things that need to be baked into your approach to brand awareness and to brand marketing. So it's not just that they recognize your name, they recognize your logo. They also need to understand, do you have a particular point of differentiation? Is there particular buying situations where they need to think of you? And that needs to be instilled, in their minds, through your marketing, as you try to create these kind of memory traces in the minds of your future buyers. And this is a very, very different way of thinking than what you see within performance marketing teams that are obsessed with simply capturing people that have an active current demand.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing, kind of knowing how this works and having a view of what marketing funnel metrics look like for different types of sources where you can spend money. And as a CMO, it's something I'm always thinking and obsessing about. And I think a lot of people in the B2B space do as well. But really, what really is exciting to me, it's exciting, but also it's damning to just the demand capture approach, right? It's exciting that by doing content towards, kind of towards your target audience, even if they aren't in market, will help put you part of that consideration set. Whereas if you spend only your time on the 5% that are actually in market, you're going to have, you only have a 5% chance of winning the deal. Most
Right.
people are going to, a good share of people are going to go no decision anyway for multiple different reasons. We have also seen, certainly CFO, you can measure when somebody comes from Google, and be able to tie that to your spend. But the fact of the matter is, there's no affinity to your brand, right? So the chance for that person who you've exposed to your content and they've downloaded a piece of your content or something like that, and then you call them, they're new to your brand, right?
Right. Well, and the other thing they have to take in mind is that a large part of brand awareness is tied to your market share position. So if you're selling a CRM and your name is Salesforce, pretty much everyone that's in market is going to know your name.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of other CRMs that people may or may not know your name. And so what happens is that the top 1 to 3 market leaders will generally always be in that consideration set. simply because they've had enough longevity and they've had enough exposure over time in the market that people know that if you say CRM, you should at least consider Salesforce as an option. And so it's going to be in there in that consideration set. And and so the challenge is, how do you get in there if you're a challenger brand? If you've got a small market share, you haven't had the longevity or just the sheer marketing dollars to be able to blanket the market with your messaging. And that becomes the real challenge is how do you, the phrase I always use is, you want to look bigger than you are, and you want to look
Hmm.
large where you are. And this is one of the reasons why differentiation and market niching is important, because it allows a small company to concentrate their spending on a small fraction of the market so that they have as large a voice in that small niche as the market leaders do. And so this also becomes a very key part of how you approach brand strategy. The last thing I'd throw in there as well is a bit of a quibble, but I think it's an important one, which is this kind of perverse notion that has grown up in the last few years in marketing, especially in B2B, around the term demand creation. And the fact is that there's absolutely no such thing as demand creation. That that people bring themselves in market when there has been some fundamental state change within their organization that surfaces a new need. And that need is widely recognized and urgent. And when those conditions are met, then they come in market. And at that point, you can capture them as leads, you can do the demand capture. But there's nothing that you're going to be able to do as an outside third party marketer to be able to generate demand where there's no need, to generate demand out of thin air. And I think this is a very dangerous notion, because it leads people to imagine that they should do certain things that make absolutely no sense. And one of the challenges you have in brand marketing in general, and especially in B2B, is that you have very long buying cycles. So you typically are seeing, 2, 3, 4, 5 years between purchase cycles. If someone buys a brand new accounting system, they're not going to need a new one in 6 months. If someone buys a CRM, they're not going to need a new one in a year. So you have very long buying cycles, long periods of time to forget, literally to forget that you exist, and very, very short attention span. So if you have just installed a new accounting package, you are probably not really interested in reading about accounting packages. And so your attention span, if someone is trying to develop some sense of brand awareness or some mental availability about their product, that prospect's attention span is very short, which means that you've got a very, very narrow window to communicate who you are and why why you should be considered important. And a lot of what you see is is kind of longer form performance marketing that tries to get shoehorned into brand awareness marketing. And if you imagine that you can induce someone to buy who doesn't have a need, it's going to lead you to do things that are completely nonsensical and are going to be, are going to not be effective at the things you need to do, which is to connect your core brand identity with your category in a memorable way, that's going to be tied to recall triggers that are associated with buying situations.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think the key in what you said before is maybe it's not demand creation, it's brand awareness, with an emphasis on awareness for the potential buying set. But let's pivot a second here, Dale, because I want to drill into put your CFO hat on for a second, if you would, because I know you've sat in that chair and
Okay.
you've sat in the sales chair. And, so if your CFO is challenging you as a marketer about this, what are some of the tactics and strategies you can take as the leader of the marketing team to help convince your CFO that, hey, brand awareness does make sense for us to do, for us to invest in?
So in some ways, I think this is a very simple argument and a very easy argument. Um, you've got to abandon the ROI thinking, which is really has infected marketing groups in very negative ways. And if you are a finance person, you thoroughly understand the distinction between different investment classes and differences in the payback period and the payback mechanisms for different investment classes. So, if you're the head of production, and you need a new factory, um, and you go to the CFO and you say, we're going to build this factory out in the middle of an open field because, what's the ROI on a building? It just sits there and consumes repair costs constantly. There plus, we're in a hurry to get this factory built. So we're going to, building, spending resources on building a building first is just a waste of time and energy. Um, we're just going to build this factory out in the middle of an open field. The CFO would think you're crazy. And because the CFO understands that the building that houses the factory is a different asset class with a different payback period and a different payback mechanism versus the machines on the factory floor that are producing widgets. And that what that building does is it makes all of the other investments more valuable. It makes the machines last longer. It allows you to to produce more stuff per week. It basically enhances the efficiency and the effectiveness of everything that's inside the building. And so this sort of longer term brand awareness marketing is very much like the building that the factory's in, where the performance marketing, producing a lead that can go to sales, that can be closed in the next 2 months, is very much like the machine tool on the factory floor that's cranking out a widget that you get to sell next week. And and so these are very different asset classes. And the deal with brand awareness is that if the buyer knows who you are before they're ready to buy, you're going to be able to have a higher likelihood of being in the consideration set, a higher likelihood of being chosen in the final selection. You're typically going to have a faster close cycle because there's already a higher level of familiarity and trust. And you're probably most important, and this is, I think, the most critical thing to take back to the CFO, is you're going to have enhanced pricing power. The reason that a market share leader is able to price their product in a relatively price insensitive way compared to a challenger brand is because there is already awareness and trust and confidence that this purchase is going to be a low risk purchase, and therefore they're going to be willing to pay a higher premium in order to make a lower risk purchase. Where if they're buying a completely unknown challenger brand that they only heard about last week because they saw you when they did a Google search, and they suddenly discovered you're a complete unknown. You're gonna, no matter how good your product is and no matter how good your history is, you're going to be perceived as a higher risk option. And your option may be so compelling that they're going to take that even though it is a higher risk option, but someone has to pay the risk premium. And what happens is the risk premium comes back on the company that's selling the product in the form of discounts, in the form of lower prices than they would have been able to charge if they had been perceived as a more trustworthy or a more reliable supplier. And so, and I think that's one of the areas where marketing in general tends to not understand their power within the company, that they've got enormous ability to drive pricing power. And you can do a 20% savings in your cost, and that will be nothing compared to doing a 1 or 2% increase in your profit margins. So very small increases in pricing can have oversized impacts in terms of profit margins. And basically the sales team cannot produce pricing power. Production can't produce pricing power. Really, only marketing has the ability to produce pricing power. And that is an enormously important thing for the long-term success of a company.
Yeah, I love that a lot, Dale. And thank you for kind of bringing us into the language of the CFO, right? The different asset class. I think people who are not trained in marketing think about marketing as the icing on top of the cake, rather than part of the cake itself. But the truth is,
Right.
the marketing is the cake. You don't, your engineers don't just get a pass to go disappear and build whatever your product is. And, how often do you have the CFO talking about what's the ROI of the engineering team, or getting up in the morning, or, of the building that you're creating for the factory, right?
Right.
I mean, the marketing is the product, ultimately, is the way I look at it. And that's kind of what I took away from what you said. And you talked about, when we talked before, about sales being sort of inputs are matching the outputs, versus in a situation where you have the non-linear benefit of doing good marketing. And I'm going to have you comment on that, Dale, and that's probably the last thing that we can hit, and then we'll wrap up.
So, yeah, I mean, the other thing is that marketing is basically is a nonlinear multiplier of the efficiency and effectiveness of the sales team. So, if I want to sell close twice as many deals next year, I basically need twice the size of a sales team. So there's a very linear relationship between how many salespeople I've got in the field and how many deals I'm going to be able to close. I'm not going to be able to have my existing team suddenly close twice as many deals. But if you look in marketing has the ability to massively increase the leads that are going into sales, the quality of those leads, with a relatively minor increase in their underlying cost. So they have this ability to really be a nonlinear multiplier of the work that the sales team is doing and of the efficiency of the sales team. So it becomes a very, very good investment class, from the CFO standpoint, in the sense that, in the same way that building that the factory is in many ways kind of a nonlinear multiplier, that if it's raining, the factory keeps running. If it's cold out, the factory keeps running. The machines last twice as long because they're not being rained on. So, you get this one-time investment that has this huge multiplying effect on the return that you get on these other investments, the return you get on the machine tools within the factory. And so, marketing is very much the same way, that they've got the ability to really expand the rate of growth of the company in a way that sales really can't do. And then they can take that fixed investment in sales and they can make it more efficient. They can do things that will reduce the close cycle, that will do things that will increase the probability of close, and the ability to increase the price point. And so, each one of these things, directly feed into basically amplifying the sales velocity that's being generated by the sales team.
Yeah, I love that, Dale, and I love your perspective here and your kind of scientific approach. And unfortunately that's the last thing we have time for today. So, but thanks so much for being here, Dale.
Oh, this has been great. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to all of you for joining us out there. Please remember to subscribe, tick the bell, and we'll see you on the next episode of Closing Time.